Hello, I'm Stephen Fagin, curator of the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, and thank you for joining us today for a special conversation with artist Gage Mace. Like so many young people in the early 1960s, Gage was deeply inspired by President Kennedy, and he even had the chance to briefly see the president in August of 1962. Decades later, as a professional artist in Portland, Oregon, Gage responded to the assassination in a unique way by creating a life-size triptych, recreating the shooting here in Dealey Plaza. And today we're going to be talking to Gage about his memories, his artwork, and how in so many ways those memories inform and inspire that art. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Gage Mace. Gage, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
It's good to be here, Stephen.
Let's go way back. Tell us a little bit about how, as an 8-year-old during that 1960 campaign, how you saw John F. Kennedy. What did he mean to you at that point?
Well, at that point, at the age of 8, he meant that I couldn't get to see my Felix the Cat cartoon program one day coming back from school, which was my usual routine. And the reason was because the local station ran or reran the debate between Kennedy and Nixon. And so I think at that early stage, I didn't really have a strong perception of him. And that's something that grew as the years went by. And I think that actually the real motivation behind my association at that age with JFK was the space program. And my father was a test pilot back then. And so the space program was something that really interested me a lot. I would say that was probably my main focus. And then seeing JFK so present in a lot of those speeches and talking about going to the moon and back within the decade, those kinds of things really were powerful for me. And I think that's really the point where I began to identify with Kennedy, what he meant to the country, and to me personally, because of my own interest in the space program.
Did it feel different for you, Dwight Eisenhower being the first president you have any memory of, being this grandfatherly figure? Did it seem different to have a younger man in the White House?
It did. And I think it brought the government or the leadership in the United States at that point a lot closer to me, and I'm sure it had that effect on lots of other kids. And because this was a guy who was my father's age, and so that generation was the generation that I encountered most of the time through teachers and just going out and about in the world. That made him a much more immediate figure to me. And so he was accessible in that way.
Now, you were living in Beverly Hills during the Kennedy years.
Well, part of the Kennedy years, the first part of his presidency, we lived in one of the canyons. I'm sure you've heard of the Bel Air fire, which was 1961. And that was where we lived during the first part of the Kennedy administration. And then we were with my grandmother in Beverly Hills for a brief period of time. That's the period of time during which I saw JFK. Then we lived in Italy for a year, and we came back and we stayed again with my grandmother from August of '63, and then we were there for the assassination.
Okay, so two key moments of the Kennedy years for you. The moment you saw the president and the assassination both happened in the same location. Now, you got to see the president. It was a very monumental day for you at the age of 10 in August 1962. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, by that time, I was totally pumped on JFK. So from the identification with him during the space program and through those years, which was still ongoing at that point, by the time of that trip he made to Los Angeles, I was determined to see him. And because I knew he was going to be at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, in Beverly Hills, which is only a few blocks from my grandmother's. And we knew that he was going to the Good Shepherd Church, which was also a short distance away, a few blocks. I thought between those two places, I'm sure to get a view of him. So the first time that or the first attempt was at the Good Shepherd Church. And my mom, who had been in show business, was a beautiful woman, very charming, and had a voice that on the radio was to die for. And she did her best and tried to find out from somebody at the church, I think she called, to find out which mass the president was going to attend. And of course, they wouldn't tell her. So as it turned out, we missed that mass. We found out it was a morning service. And I figured my best shot then was to go to the Beverly Hills Hotel and just wait in the lobby until he eventually showed up. And I had no idea when that would be or what he was doing that day after church. So I went there, got all dressed up in my little suit, went to the hotel, and I made a pest of myself and tried to get information from all the different people who worked in the hotel, the bellhops, the desk people, all of that. And they didn't know either. I mean, not really. So they said, I don't know, he could be here anytime. He comes and goes whenever he wants. So I just decided I would wait. But the thing about the lobby there is that there were two entrances to the hotel. And one was a garage entrance, or not a garage technically, but it was a back entrance that led to the garage. And so that was a way that he could come. And then on the other side of the lobby was the main lobby entrance, which opened onto Wilshire Boulevard. And because I didn't know which way he'd be coming in, and neither did anybody else at the hotel, I just went back and forth all afternoon long. And I had no idea at that point. I had this, I imagined that at that point he was meeting with the governor and doing these very important things, when of course the whole time he was at Santa Monica Beach, and he went in for that famous swim of his, which is documented by a famous photograph taken by a staff journalist named Bill Beebe. And that's what he was doing. He was at Peter Lawford's house that afternoon, which actually had a back entrance to the public beach area. So when he went for his famous swim, and for those of your viewers who aren't familiar with that, he left the guarded back entrance to Peter Lawford's house, which was enclosed with a big tarpaulin. And just on the spur of the moment, totally unplanned, he took off, headed across the beach, while some police officers were panicked and trying to catch up with him. And as he headed toward the water, he took his shirt off, handed it to somebody, and dived into the water. Swam for, I understand, about 20 minutes to a half an hour. And by that time, the word had gone up and down the beach that JFK was there. And a huge crowd of several hundred people gathered. And as he emerged from the water, that's when that photograph was taken. And then he went on to the hotel where I had been waiting for several hours and was just on the point of giving up. By that time, I'm guessing it was about 6 o'clock at least in the evening. And I was, again, going back and forth between the two entrances. And I was standing by the front entrance when a man in a suit walked up to me and said, "Son, would you please step aside?" And I took about 2 steps back, and then JFK walked in with a small entourage. And I had the 2 or 3 seconds of him in full view, where he was about, I don't think he was more than certainly not more than 10 feet away, maybe 8 feet away. And I was so stunned because I think my first reaction was that, oh my God, he's real. He's a real person. And I think a lot of us, and certainly back in those times, when the media was something that was different than what it is today. And so there was more of a remove, I think, the quality of film being one of them, black and white being another aspect of that. So that a lot of times these public figures, they were remote, they were on the news, they were on TV, but somehow they weren't real. And so seeing him in real life was really kind of a shock because it showed me, I mean, it's an obvious thing, I guess, but my God, he's real. And the other thing that really struck me was the redness of his hair. It was a really rich sort of auburn color. And that really impressed me. So I ran along to keep up with him as he headed for the elevator. And then I had a final glimpse of him turning the corner toward the elevators. So of course that was the big payoff for having waited patiently all those hours in the lobby. And that moment of film that you were able to get from USC shows the moment before I saw him. And if you look real quickly, you can see that advance man in the suit split off and cut ahead of the party. It's only like maybe not even a second long, but that's how I was able to identify that as the piece of film that's just before I saw him. And that was August 19th, 1962 was that day.
I'm still impressed that as a 10-year-old, you got dressed up in a suit and waited for hours in the lobby of that hotel. Now, as I understand it, when the president walked in, you led the lobby in applause. Isn't that right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that. Yeah, I was so stunned to see him in person. I could have gone up and shaken his hand, but the only thing I could think to do was to start clapping. And because I was the first person in the hotel lobby to see him, I was standing right there by the entrance. That cued the rest of the lobby to his entrance. Everybody else started applauding. So the moment of eye contact that I had with JFK was just as that applause started up. So I think of that moment as the moment that I started up the applause for JFK.
A powerful moment, I know, that's been with you for all of these years, and one that I know came to mind again just a year and 3 months later on November 22nd, 1963, when you were just across the street from the Beverly Hilton at El Rodeo School.
That's right.
Tell me about that day, what you remember.
Well, the main thing about that day was that the school officials did not disclose the information about the assassination until the very end of the day. We had just gone to our library period, had returned to class, and Mrs. Melnicker, my sixth grade teacher, said, class, I have an announcement that I need to make. And she was sitting on the edge of her desk and she began to sob. And at first I thought, and maybe some of the other kids too, but I had actually had this happen once before in another grade where a teacher, we were so bad that day that the teacher actually cried. And I thought maybe we had been too boisterous in the library or something, and she was upset about that. Well, a moment went by as she collected herself, and then she said, President Kennedy was assassinated today in Dallas. And then she said, class dismissed, and the bell rang, and we all just left in a state of shock, went out into the hallway and all our separate ways to home. And so it didn't really sink in until I got home. I rode my bike to school back in those days. And it was about, and so again, this was my grandmother's house in Beverly Hills. And so it was about, I guess, maybe a 10-block bike ride that took 10 minutes or so. And it didn't really hit me until I arrived home and I saw my mom standing on the back porch steps. And then it landed on me. And I just broke down. And I think I cried for probably, I don't know, for a long time after that, maybe an hour of solid tears. And later on, many years later, I encountered a former classmate from that same sixth grade class, Mrs. Melnicker's class. She had become a writer and was doing a book reading here in Portland, Oregon, where I live. And this was in the year 2000. And I went down there and I remembered her well from class. She was kind of an exotic, willowy girl who I remember walking across the schoolyard holding her books in this very sort of, how sixth, seventh grade girls can be, and very inaccessible to me at that point. But I wanted to find out if she could corroborate my memory of that day. So I went to the book reading. It was at a Walden Books, I think, here in Portland. And there were just a few people. It was a typical New Yorker cartoon kind of a book reading where there were a half a dozen people. And after that, and after she read a little bit and spoke, I went up to the table and I introduced myself. I said, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Gage Mace, and we were in the sixth grade together with Mrs. Melnicker. And before I got any farther than that, she got this intense look in her eyes. She pulled herself forward. She didn't remember me from school. But when I told her that I had been in the same classroom with her, she leaned forward and she said, "Do you remember what do you remember about the day JFK was shot?" And I said, "Wow, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. It's one of the, I didn't want to tell her that was the only reason I was there, but I said, I wanted to ask you the same question. And I said, what I remember about it is that they didn't tell us until the end of the school day." And she said, no, that's not what happened. And I'm not exaggerating the intensity in her voice. And I found out later on what motivated her own intense interest in that, and that being that her older sister had been and who was a pretty famous director and writer, had been an intern at the JFK White House. And so Amy, my classmate, would have been younger than 10 at that point, 10 or thereabouts. So that would have made a big impression in her life. And but I was just shocked when she said that she couldn't corroborate my memory. And what she said was that they told us as the news unfolded, they brought in a television set. We all watched Walter Cronkite announce the death, and then were dismissed from school early. And I didn't say anything to that. I was just so shocked that I sat with that for many years, and I began to question whether I was the one who was wrong about the memory. And several years passed, and it was coming up on the 50th anniversary of the assassination. And I thought, I better research this, especially while hopefully some of those folks were still alive. As it happened, Mrs. Melnicker was still living, and our principal, Mr. Scott, was still living. And I got the contact information from the school. I emailed Mr. Scott, and indeed, my memory was the correct memory. And I still have the email that he sent that documented the step-by-step procedure that was taken during the day, from the moment that it first was broadcast to the faculty, and the decisions that were made to keep the news out of the school. They actually posted what he called PTA moms at the school entrances and exits so that nobody could come into the school with the news. And they were able to, of course, that would never happen today, of course, but it would never even work. But back in those days, you could still control the flow of information in a way that's impossible now. So they were actually able to seal off the school and keep that information from getting in. There were kids who left during the day. There were, and I found this out a little bit later, there were parents who came to get their kids early, and they just kind of quietly left, and nobody knew what happened to them until much later. But my memory was the correct memory. And so it really started me thinking a lot about how memory works. And what is memory, the nature of it, and how we fabricate it as we go along. And especially since those times, we've all been exposed to so many programs, documentaries, and so on about those times, and especially the assassination, that we've absorbed those images into our collective memory. And I think maybe that's what happened to my ex-schoolmate, is something similar to that. But and I ran into her. She did another reading after I got all this information at Powell's bookstore here in Portland, and I went to that as well. And she called me. By then, she remembered me, of course, and she called me up, and she put her arm around me, and she said, "Yes, Gage and I were in the class the day JFK was assassinated. And remember, Gage, they rolled in the TV," and she recounted the very same wrong memory. And of course, I wasn't going to say anything in front of a group of people. And so I just went along with it. But that was a really fascinating aspect of what happened that day, and how our memories were the complete opposite of each other.
Yeah, the fallibility of memory is something that we encounter quite often here with the Oral History Project.
I can imagine, yeah.
You encountered President Kennedy in person in August of 1962. You experienced the assassination, and then jumping ahead to the 1980s when you were serving in Armed Forces Radio, you were able to encounter the legacy of President Kennedy in Germany. Tell me about that.
Well, it was really interesting, Stephen, because I think what happens in our own country, especially with, and probably most recently with JFK, is we're a pretty ethnocentric country, and it's a place where you can go travel 3,000 miles and still be in the same country. And so we're all familiar in a collective sense of JFK's legacy and those times. But it was really something to go to a different country and see the effect that he had on an entirely different people. I think, and of course, when I was in Berlin, this was in the early 80s. And so the way that Berlin looked then was the same as it had looked when JFK had been there 20 years before. So the wall still existed. The where he spoke, and I'm sure it's all of those. The Rathaus Schöneberg was where he made the famous "Ich bin ein Berliner" speech, and they have changed and did shortly after. I think it was within hours after the assassination. They changed the big plaza in front of the stand where he spoke to John F. Kennedy Platz. And so there was a sense going there and going to the observation platform where he looked over the wall into East Berlin, and following in those footsteps was like being in the echo of his presidency and of the Ich bin ein Berliner speech. So that had a big impact on me because I was seeing it in a sense through his eyes as an American in Berlin, seeing the way that the city had been divided, East and West, communist and capitalist, and so on. And of course, that's all different now, but back then it was more meaningful to have that experience. And also the experience of talking to people who remembered Ich bin ein Berliner, who went to that speech and experienced it, and who had a very strong feeling for JFK. And that was the thing that really impressed me, was the feeling tone and how emotional people got when they started talking about JFK and what he meant to the German people as a whole, but to Berliners especially, because they were cut off from the West in a way that no other place did at that time. Berlin was kind of unique in that way. And they called it the Island of Freedom. And there were a lot of other ways to describe Berlin at that time, but it was literally true because West Berlin existed as a little island in the middle of East Germany. So when Kennedy went there, it was very meaningful to them. The speech had a huge impact on them. And so I think that that kind of came back to me, redoubled, as a way to appreciate him, having seen it through their eyes, as someone who was as significant as I had felt all along, and as many of us Americans feel, but that it validated that feeling to a great extent.
By the early 90s, around the 30th anniversary of the assassination, you're living in Portland as an artist, and this is your moment. This is when you're going to respond to the assassination 3 decades later, and not just respond. You're going to respond in a very profound way with a life-size oil painting, a triptych that is 4.5 feet by 14 feet, right? The assassination of President Kennedy.
That's right, yes. And that painting, after I was in Armed Forces Radio, got out in the about the mid 80s, And I had been wanting to become an artist for several years, that desire growing with each passing year. So I had determined that once I got out of the Air Force, it was at that time, that I would study painting and become an artist. And so that's what I did. And I studied with a man named Jan Sather, a great classical realist, Norwegian painter. And he painted enormous paintings. He painted paintings the size of a barn door and figurative paintings and in the classical realist style, which is what I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn the techniques of the old masters. So somewhere in there, and I think it had always been kind of a vague desire. I want to put what I feel into images. That was my vague desire for a long time. And as I zeroed in on painting and the craft, and it became real for me, more real for me as time went on, and got here to Portland, I said, okay, this everything began to fall into place. I'm going to paint it big, and I'm going to use the Zapruder film as my source material. And back 30 years ago here in Portland, it was still relatively cheap to live here, and you could still rent a studio for, I had a place that was 750 square feet. It was under $400. I think it started out at $350 a month, which nowadays, when I tell people that, they kind of look at me like, how old are you anyway? But it was true back then. So I had a nice big studio space with 14 or 16-foot high ceilings. I can't quite remember. And so I got my artist materials together. I decided on the format that I did, this long, narrow format, basically horizontal, because in a way it mimicked the format of film. And so there was never really any doubt for me about using the Zapruder film as source material, because for most of us Americans, and for me as an artist, it's the template for the assassination, not only visually, but in terms of the timing of it and what happened when, and all of those kinds of things. But it has an emotional impact that nothing else has, because it is literally the assassination. So that's what I used for my model. But so I built my canvases. I made it a triptych because I felt it would be more versatile in the way that it could be displayed. It could be displayed with the panels all together, so it was one continuous image, or it could be broken apart if there was an opportunity, for instance, to enhance the idea of it being based on a film. And there's a way that you could almost say that that painting is a painting about a film as much as it is about the assassination itself. But the emotional content was what was really important to me. And so, because I was wanting to do a painting that was essentially realistic and based on the realist aesthetic, that there was a need to enlarge and enhance the imagery that we see in the film. And of course, we've all been exposed to all of these different enhanced versions of the Zapruder film, these attempts to try to make the imagery as clear as possible so that we can analyze what happened. And so blowing it up to the size and the format that I was working in meant that everything was pretty close to life size, which meant that things that we see as being more blurry in the film, and of course when they're enlarged, they're even blurrier still, that it would go the opposite way. It would become more and more clear as it got bigger. And so in the painting, that was my biggest challenge, was to work with the imagery that we're all accustomed to being somewhat blurry, grainy, and distant in that way, and bringing it up to something that was much more immediate, more personal, more emotionally powerful, but which also meant that I had to tweak the facial expressions, the figures. I had to conflate different frames of the film so that it landed on one particular moment, and that was very challenging. And I had to pose a great many friends, just about everybody that I knew in Portland who was willing to do this, and have them model for some of those poses of the figures in the car, of Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent, of the witnesses, and everybody who is in that painting is represented by somebody who posed for it, using both the literal images from the film and other photographs that I found, and having my friends step in to mimic those exact same poses in order to enhance them and make them clearer. So that was really very challenging in the painting of that.
We're grateful to you for donating the painting to the museum last year. And when you did that, you included some fantastic photographs of this work in progress, because you worked on this for about 4 years, right?
That's right. That's right.
Looking at some of these work in progress images, it's really interesting to see the evolution, because what I'm imagining is one of the earliest iterations of the painting. It looks almost identical to the Zapruder film. The details are very soft and fuzzy. It almost looks like just a replication of the film. And you went from that to something that was hyper realistic, making the limousine shiny, so much so that you can actually see a reflection of the eyewitnesses and the grassy knoll and the pergola on the north side, the side of the audience's perspective, which is just fascinating. Talk a little bit about how you achieved some of those hyper realistic details that we take for granted when we look at a painting like this.
Well, I think that the car that you mentioned is one place where we really see the realism heightened to the effect that you're talking about, where it's hyper real in a way. And what the way I was able to do that, and this goes back to my training with Jan back in Los Angeles, was one of the old master techniques that everybody hears about, but they don't have a clear idea what it is. It's called glazing. And so by the time I got to the full realization of the imagery that's represented as a reflection on the side of the car, and kind of stepping back from that, you mentioned the painting as a whole. I started out with a black and white underpainting, which is also a typical old master's method, that you map out the painting in advance in black and white, and then you build on that. And there's a way technically that that's supposed to work that enhances the darker areas and enables the highlights and the areas that are receiving light to become emphasized. So by the time I got to really the final stages of the painting is where the glazing comes in. And what that involves is applying a transparent layer of paint to the element in the painting. In this case, it was the car. So I used ultramarine blue, which is a transparent paint, and brush that over the portion of the car that I worked on. You couldn't do it all at once because it's a process that requires the paint to set up within a window of time. So if you try to cover too broad an area at a time, the paint will, at some point in the process, it'll dry ahead of your ability to work into it, because that's what is needed, is that you apply the glaze, and it's like a veil that covers everything that you had already painted in the underpainting stage, so that you can still see it. But again, it's like looking through a veil, and then you work into that transparent layer with whatever the local colors are, which mostly in this case was blue, but there are also touches of other colors in there, red, or the colors that you see, which are reflected images, have certain local colors that need to stand out. But in the context of the glaze, it all pulls together into a unified effect. so that the trick, as it were, is that you're looking at the surface of a solid image that is reflecting stuff that is around it. So that's a glazing technique. And I think it probably took, I don't know, maybe, and also because the way the car is divided up. So you would have to work, for instance, from the seam of one door to a particular other part of the car, let's say the rear of the car, and try to do that all at one go. And so it meant really you still had to work pretty quickly to catch up or stay on top of the drying of the paint. But that was all a glazing technique. And so a lot of those highly reflective surfaces were done the same way. And there were little touches there. For instance, the mirror housing that, and as I look off here, I'm looking at a color reproduction, my own reproduction of the painting. But just in front of the front door is a mirror housing, and that also has the reflection of the street, a very narrow band that reflects the grassy knoll and then the sky. So that was also done with a glazing technique, and all of those reflective surfaces were done the same way with that same technique.
Wow. Every time I look at this, there's so many details that pop out that I want to ask about. There's a little boy just above Clint Hill with his hands covering his ears, and it's not necessarily a particular identified eyewitness. As I understand it, that little boy is representative for you of all the children who lost President Kennedy.
Exactly.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, he's the actual model for that boy. He's well, now he's probably in his 30s, but he's the son of an artist friend of mine. She's also in the painting. You just see the bottom at the very back there, the bottom of a sort of gray-blue raincoat. And so Brian is the little boy's real name. And yeah, he's kind of a stand-in for myself, but also for other children who were there that day, that you see in passing. If you watch the Zapruder film, you do see a number of children. Some of them are just blurs. There's one that's always stuck in my mind. And I've researched it, and I can't remember the actual person's name, but she's a girl in a red dress who is standing more or less opposite the entrance to the Texas School Book Depository. And she steps off the curb and she kind of stops when she sees what's going on. And she saw the headshot. And so there are a number of kids, and I think two of the children of Bill and Gail Newman. You don't see them in the painting, but they were being protected by their parents from the curbside, looking into the car. And so, yeah, the little boy kind of stands in for all the child witnesses who were there that day, as well as the generation that represents the baby boomer folks who were aware of the event and for whom it became a signal event in their lives, something that has been a part of their living experience throughout their lives.
This is clearly such a personal work for you, something that I suppose your 10-year-old self demanded of you, that you respond in such a way. All these years later, memory fading into history, how do you hope young people who have no memories whatsoever of the 1960s, what do you hope they gain from seeing this painting?
Well, I think what there is when I was painting the painting, there was music that I listened to. And one of the pieces that I listened to over and over again was a piece of music that I discovered in what I think is one of the best JFK commemorative documentaries that we have, which is called JFK Remembered. And it's a piece that's called The Unanswered Question. It's by a composer named Charles Ives. And I think that really signifies, just by virtue of the title, even though he didn't this was a piece that he wrote years and years before. It has nothing to do with JFK or the Kennedy assassination or anything, but it just happens to fit like a jigsaw piece into that identity that we have of the Kennedy legacy as being the great unanswered question in modern American history, and to me signifies the mythology of the Kennedy years and the way that we remember him. The unanswered question is the road not taken, what might have happened if he had lived, all of those, would there have been Vietnam the way that it happened, all of those things that Oliver Stone has dealt with in his film and a lot of what he says, that we come across again in different iterations, in different contexts. But I think this is really the burden that we carry forward, is what would have happened if he had lived? How different would things have been? And so I think that that's an important aspect of the Kennedy experience, his years and the assassination, to carry forward. But along with that, I think there are certain values that come with that. And I think they include a way that government can be responsive to the needs of the people. That would include equity and inclusion. That would include a concern for the environment. And some of the issues that we've especially seen most recently in our history are things that are reflected through the Kennedy legacy in a way I feel are important for people, generations going forward. And so my hope would be for people who see this painting, who think about Kennedy and the legacy of his presidency, that they think certainly the assassination is part of that. And it really is the fulcrum that really operates the rest of the ongoing dynamics that pertain to our view of him, but that they also carry this idea of progressive government and progressive ideals that were things that JFK was very concerned about. And again, we don't know where he might have gone with some of those issues, but civil rights certainly was something that we really started to see get underway during the Kennedy years. I've talked about the space program, science, exploration, open-mindedness. Those are the kinds of things that I hope people carry with them going forward.
That's wonderful. Such an extraordinary painting, and we are so very grateful that you chose this museum as a repository for it. Gage Mace, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure, Stephen.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation with artist Gage Mace. Join us next time for a conversation with an Arkansas artist, Tansel Stow Anthony. She created, leading up to the 50th anniversary of the assassination in 2013, a series of paintings that she called Fading Memories in honor of JFK, which is now part of the collection here at the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.